Presentation has basically three parts. The first is about the conclusions of the ELMA assessment. The second explains the causes of unemployment and underemployment in Uganda and West Nile specifically. And the third is a set of recommendations. Okay, let's move to the conclusions. The first conclusion is that unemployment and underemployment are not caused by the lack of skills. The last few years, Uganda has been strongly advocating for the skilling policy, but we didn't find evidence that the lack of skills is causing unemployment or underemployment. Actually, what is causing the problem of unemployment in the region and in Uganda in general is the absence of a dynamic and diversified private sector. Few people invest in business in Uganda and even less in the northern part of the country. And that's why they don't demand skilled or unskilled workers. So the main problem is the lack of businesses. The third conclusion is if the vocational and technical education is not accompanied by business development, innovation, and access to capital, is not going to produce any positive outcome. Because we also have seen that the people who take the training courses, the technical and vocational training, they do take the courses because they want to create their own business, to be self-employed, not looking for a job. So most of the people, after finishing the training, just start their own small businesses, and they hardly contract anyone to work for them. Now, I'm going to elaborate more on the causes of the lack of demand and the causes for the absence of small and medium-sized enterprises. The first thing is the composition of the private sector in Uganda and in West Nile. You see, around 95% of the businesses are sole traders or family micro-enterprises. So you can only see few small and medium-sized enterprises and even less large companies. And the other characteristic is most of them work in non-tradable goods and services, meaning they sell the products and the service in the same place they live in. This is not a kind of exchange with other regions in the country. And we also looked at the composition of the records in the districts. You see in Arua almost 600 enterprises registered, in Moyo 603, and in Adjumani 851. But none of these records are updated. Probably most of these businesses have already disappeared, but they keep the records. There's no follow-up on this registration and the records. What are the causes for the limited number of small and medium-sized enterprises in Uganda? First is access to capital and finance. It's almost a general complaint. Everybody complains about the limitations to get credit and to access to capital. Then access to technology is another limitation. The infrastructure, you see the state of the roads, the lack of electricity is a huge problem in Uganda and especially in West Nile. Access to markets and business information. There's no business intelligence of specific services for small and medium-sized enterprises. And it's interesting to see an assessment of the investment climate in Uganda shows that only 9% of the managers consider the education and skills as a serious obstacle. So in the list of priorities, they put almost at the end the skilling of workers as a constraint. Then the second element, which limits the creation of jobs and employment in Uganda, is basically the agriculture and the low productivity in agriculture. The country still depends very much on agriculture. 70% of the people are employed in agriculture, and more than 43% work in subsistence agriculture, meaning very low productivity. And yeah, agriculture still represents 60% of the exports. When you look at the data by product, by crops, you will see in any crop very low productivity. And low productivity in agriculture means that there is no surplus of food, and it also implies there is no surplus of labor, no savings, and no investment in different activities. So the low productivity in agriculture is a huge constraint for local development and economic development. Then the third element is the population and its correlation with economic growth. Uganda has one of the highest population growths in Africa. And when you compare the agricultural output and the population growth, you will see that since 1965, the population have grown 5 times, while the food production increased only 3 times. So it means food security is an issue, and the population keeps on growing, which creates more problems in this regard. And also the population growth has implications for capital accumulation and entrepreneurship. Yeah, in some cases, people talk about the demographic dividend, meaning when you have a large number of young people can support a smaller group of old retired people. This is, in few words, the demographic dividend. It has 2 implications. On one hand, young people are more innovative, more risk-taking, and they can push for new incentives or to create new businesses. But at the same time, this large number of young people mean that families and households have less money for education, for food, and less capital accumulation. So at the end, the 2 effects offset each other. So you have innovation on one side, and on the other side, less capital accumulation. So that's why high rates of population growth are not really helping the innovation in Uganda. Then the capital accumulation and access to credit, as I mentioned, are big limitants. When you look at the credit to the private sector as a percentage of the GDP, you will see Uganda is very low in the regional ranking. And the interest rate is also very high. So you have the worst possible scenario, low access to credit and very high interest rates. Then the fifth element that hampers the employment and economic growth is human capital, the expenditure in education and health. Yeah, if you compare with the neighbor countries, the expenditure of education is very low. And in addition to that, the quality of the education is also bad, because in average in Uganda, an 18 years old person has 7 years of schooling. But when you compare these years of schooling with the years of learning, it becomes only 4.4 years of learning. So the quality of education is really a big concern, and also in terms of health. When you look at the figures compared with other countries, the expenditure in health is very low, and I wonder what are they doing now with this corona crisis. In the same line of human capital, around 70% of the people have no education or technical skills. And the people who has completed the secondary school or even tertiary education, most of them work in services. The vocational training is very small in Uganda. The number of people attending the training courses of the technical and vocational training institutes is very small. And most of them are oriented to cope with the demand of the modern sectors of the economy, meaning oil, telecommunications, and somehow transportation. But yeah, the assessment of the quality again of this training is not encouraging, because what is lacking in general terms is a solid basis on arithmetic and written and oral communication, which is acquired at basic education level. So the vocational training cannot solve problems created in basic education. Finally, the sixth element which hampers the economic development is the low execution of the capital expenditure by the government. Government misses the targets every year, and they implement only 60% of the capital budget. And again, if you compare with neighboring countries, the amount devoted for capital expenditure is very low. That's why the infrastructure is in dire condition. By any metrics you see, Uganda is lagging behind. One additional element is the low level of urbanization. Urbanization creates economies of agglomeration. And if you don't have large urban concentrations, it's very difficult to create economic development in the rural area as well. So the economies of agglomeration create an additional boost for economic development, and is connected with rural development as well. You can see the assessment of urban population versus GDP per capita, and very strong correlation. And finally, a remark that the economic growth has been very high in the last 12, 15 years, but is mainly concentrated in the most dynamic sectors of the economy: oil, public infrastructure, and telecommunications. It's not labor intensive. That's why it's not related with employment. Some figures about the level of unemployment in the 3 districts we have worked on. And finally, let me go quickly through the recommendations. We have a set of recommendations. First, for the skills. We need to develop more skills in specific sectors, such as the mechanization of agriculture, and the production of agricultural tools and implements. So, as I mentioned, the low productivity in agriculture is the main constraint, and the way to address is through frugal innovation, people producing tools and implements for agriculture. You have a list of possible skills in this regard. Then green economy is also an area in which it's worth to invest in skilling people. And also there's a growing market for solar panels and solar energy. Most of donors are pushing for the construction of solar grids, so it can be also an opportunity to create skills in this area. Then recommendations for entrepreneurship. The country needs to develop a system for competitions and awards to innovative entrepreneurs. And it must be connected with the vocational training. Then also access to different sources of funding, for instance, venture capital, partial guarantee funds, first loss guarantee, and other schemes that allow entrepreneurs to start business and to access to capital. Which sectors can be promoted through this innovation and entrepreneurship? We have a list of several sectors. First, agro-processing, which is fundamental. If you have 70% of the population still working in agriculture, you need to develop capacity for agro-processing. Mechanization of agriculture, production of biofuels, wind and solar energy, recycling, upgrading, reusing device, appliances, etc. And then electromechanics, precision metalworking, tourism and support industries, IT, software applications, and development. Finally, the recommendations to support the sole traders. We have seen that 90% of the entrepreneurs are sole traders. So we cannot put them aside, but they need a different scheme to support their activities. Basic training courses in numeracy, financial literacy, and perhaps combining some specific training for food handling with other soft skills. So we need a specific set of solutions for sole traders, and recommendations on how to attract investors. I think these are obvious issues to be put in place: business incubators, business accelerators, and shared service for small businesses and startups. Then support from the public sector for the registration, formalization, and other needs that may arise during the formalization process. And finally, recommendations for the local governments. We have seen a lot of weaknesses in the spatial planning. So the development plans need to be enhanced and be more realistic. Second, there is no urban planning and zoning, and it's necessary to work in urban settings as well. We are also encouraging the establishment of public-private forums for participatory planning and to look for solutions to the challenges that local businesses find. And eventually the collection of local revenues. There's a lot of potential for local governments to generate additional sources of revenue, and they need to be taken into account. Okay, that's it. Thank you.